up with your phone.
I'm turning it off. Power off. Okay. Now move on.
I think you should go.
Welcome. I understand this is the first of our 5 shiurim, which is the first series for this new wonderful kollel. I thank the directors, the board, the participants. You can send me questions or comments. The first comment I'd like from someone is, am I on? Or am I only talking to my team, Marcella and Isaac? You may see their heads pop in as they work the machine for me. The topic, you should be able to have the source sheets. Source sheets are there at the bottom of some of the pages, the HTTP, then the Uri L'Tzedek, etc. The source sheets are important because this is a shiur. It's a real big question. The very topic, obligation to protest social injustice at any price, where is that in halacha? I've decided not to go with the its investigation of the prophets, because it's either too old, prophets back then, still relevant, or it's prophets now, and anyone who says they speak in the name of God probably be put away. So actually what we're going to do is have a halachic discussion. How do reasonable Jewish people who are passionate about certain issues and feel that these are Jewish issues, how do we respond, and is protest part of this response? I didn't punctuate the title. Is it a period? So we're just talking about this topic. Is it a question mark? Can you do it really at any price? That's already an exaggeration, but really at a high price or at any price? Or is it really an exclamation mark? I'm usually prone to exclamation marks, which will be my only spoiler to what we're going to do. But the social injustice protest, very modern. What do we do to find halachic basis to understanding that topic? And there's really one terrific model, and we're going to follow that model and many of its permutations to see what the protests would mean today. Our big question about protests is, again, the price. But here the price is to society. You can protest, you tear the social fabric. Halacha generally is restorative, tries to calm things down. Protest is the opposite. You're not, you're heating things up. So it's to society. At what price to the person that you're persons or part of society, organization, whatever, or what price to them? And then, of course, the real big question is what price to the protester? If we're protesting, what price are we willing to pay? Is it only that we're willing to protest on if you're back in the Galut diaspora, there's going to be a Sunday afternoon, kind of a walk in the park. Is that the price you're going to pay? So it's a subway token. I mean, what's the price? The model that we're going to follow is the issue of hocheach tochiach, which is rebuke, and it's a mitzvah in the Torah. It's not just a concept. It's not just something that happens, but it's actually something you're supposed to do, and it takes place in Parashat Kedoshim. That should be for you source sheet A, just at the very beginning from Leviticus, the holiness code, right there in the middle, a tremendously compact accumulation of psukim that deal with selected spiritual and religious mitzvot, familial mitzvot, fear every man his mother and his father, you shall keep my Sabbaths, spiritual mitzvot, and tremendous number of mitzvot, of commandments that are part of the social fabric. 11, you should not steal. Neither shall you deal falsely, right? Lo tigbavu, lo techashashu. By the way, from this section that I took from Kedoshim, there's more, at least 9 of the 10 commandments are found within them in variations. You go a few more psukim, you get 10 out of 10, but I couldn't give every pasuk there. So how does it begin? It begins in verse 2, ye shall be holy, kadoshim to you. And the holiness comes from the spiritual, it comes from the familial and the communal, and it also very explicitly here comes from doing and not doing things that deal with the moral. 14, don't curse the deaf, don't put a stumbling block before the blind. 15, don't do unrighteousness and judgment. And then, don't go down as a talebearer. And then, if you get to verse 17, I have it there in bold, verse 17. Lo tisna et achicha bilvavecha. Don't hate thy brother in thy heart. Hocheach tochiach et amitecha. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor. V'lo tisa alav chet. And do not bear sin because of him. Now, there's clearly 3 clauses here. The first 2 verses are not that hard to first 2 clauses in the verse. Not hating, you shall surely rebuke, which is a double verb, hochech tochiach. You shall rebuke in a more literal sense. But the third one, and not bear sin because of him, can be translated in several different ways. That translation follows a little bit King James Bible, and I have various things, says don't suffer sin upon him. The Living Torah from Rabbi Kaplan of blessed memory also says not bear sin because of him. The Fox translation, which is based on the Huber Rosenzweig translation in German, and says also not bear sin. But if you look at it very literally, because we're going to come back to this verse, the lo tisa alav chet, boy. Well, first was the hochech tochech, rebuke, the one close to you, which parallels the brother that you're not supposed to hate in the first clause. And then it says ve, which could be and or but. Lo tisa alav, don't bear or don't cast. And then you need another preposition. Therefore, it's either going to be because of, or it's going to be upon him, chet, sin. Kind of complicated. But this exegetical move is going to be very important in terms of how we understand what's happening. As we learn this Torah, we have to see how far we're going in rebuke. You see some of the translations say surely rebuke, shall rebuke. When I was a rabbi in Los Angeles, the president of the sisterhood used to call me every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock to offer her comments of how well I did on the pulpit on Shabbat. It was a free service that she offered me every Sunday. Usually she wasn't very happy. And I must have said something to my family, because whenever she would call at 10 o'clock, one of the children who were young at that time would say, her name was Shirley, Shirley Rebuke is on the phone. But Shirley Rebuke means rebuke. So let's look at a couple of Talmudic sections which will use this verse either directly or, very interestingly, the verse is present even though the verse is not mentioned, but the verse becomes very important. So we're going to look at B1. We're looking at the Babylonian Talmud. The Tractate of Besa, which deals in the main, many of the concepts there have to do with festival laws, the whole notion of muksa, what you can't touch on Shabbos, certain practices that often also have their status is not a direct Torah status, not taken from the verse, but something that the rabbis added on as a fence, and that is a d'Rabbanan. It's a rabbinic. So we're at B1. Rabbi son of Chanin said to Abaye, we have a learning that you can't clap the hands, or you slap your thighs. There's ways of making noise, or dance. And this is on Shabbat and on Yom Tov. And yet we see that people do this. Actually, it's It's a rabbinic enactment. They were afraid that if people got too excited and they were dancing around and they were clapping their hands, that would lead them to pick up a musical instrument, which which is problematic for halacha, because you may fix that instrument, and fixing things in Shabbat is not necessary. Is not allowed. That's kind of the context. And but people do that. They do clap and they do slap their thighs, make some noise, or they do dance. By the way, this is still halacha that's still in conflict to this very day. People aren't sure which way to do in terms on Shabbos. Can you dance on Shabbos? Can you clap your hands? You have Hasidim and others who clap your hands only this way, that they don't do a full clap. They do a clap with a difference. Many the yeshiva people will refuse to dance on Shabbat. I was at a ufruf, right, where the groom was an old groom, had his aliyah before, and was at the yeshiva, Rabbi Moshe Feinstein, and everyone got so excited that this fellow was finally getting married, and he has a very happy marriage, by the way. This is years ago. So excited, they stood up and they started dancing, and they took Rabbi Feinstein's hand, and he was dancing, and one of the students stopped and said, "The Rebbe, the Gemara says," he quoted this Gemara, "you don't dance." And he turned and looked, and he said back in Yiddish, I'll say it in English, he said, "You call this dancing?" As they were moving very slowly around the room. But it's still an issue. He replied to them, and according to your opinion, we have something else. You're not supposed to sit at the entrance of the lechi. Lechi is part of an eruv, the surrounding place that surrounds the wire, the string, the fence, that surrounds an area that allows you to carry within, lest an object should roll away. I don't know I think I wrote that right. And you will come to carry it, and that's a problem. So therefore, you're not allowed to sit there. The problem happens to be a Torah problem, but the prohibition is a rabbinic prohibition. Don't sit somewhere where you're going to have this problem. Yet there are these women, sounds a little sexist there, who take their water jugs. The water jugs were really gourds, or they were jugs that were select, and they go and they sit at the entrance of an alley. They sit in a place where their sitting is fine and they can carry there, but it can roll very well, their jugs, and then it's almost irresistible not to go out, take the jug and bring it back. You just can't let it roll. So the rabbis say, don't do that, but they do it. But we don't say anything. But what's the answer in both cases? Let Israel go their way. In other words, don't bother Jews. It's better that they should err in ignorance than presumptuously. Better they should be, in the technical terms, they should be in ignorance. They should be shogeg. Not exactly sure they're doing something wrong, rather than say, look, we're going to do this anyway. Confirm them in doing something that is wrong. Here also, let Israel go their way. It's better that they should err in ignorance than presumptuously. Don't make them. So in other words, there's a principle here. You don't always criticize someone for doing something wrong. Sometimes you just have to say, well, don't make the situation worse. This is actually an incredible move on the rabbi's part. The rabbis almost are canceling a law in the Torah. The Torah says someone's doing something wrong. Stop them. Rebuke them. That's what it says. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor for what? Must be for something they're doing wrong. If they're doing it wrong, please rebuke them. Don't let there be sin. But they're saying, you know what? Yes, but if you know you're going to make the situation worse, don't make the situation worse. The Talmud says. This, however, applies only to a rabbinic prohibition, because all this stuff, the fact that you're not supposed to sit by the entrance, or the fact that you don't dance because you're afraid of tuning, but the prohibition of doing those things, which may be arcane, I should say, or far from us, but that principle is there. Don't make that worse. Don't bother them. But maybe it doesn't apply to a biblical prohibition. But the Talmud says back, no, it does apply to a biblical prohibition. It goes that far. It applies whether the prohibition is biblical or rabbinic. We do not tell them anything in the case of the little period of time right before Yom Kippur begins. There's a verse in the Torah which the rabbis interpret to mean that from one evening to the other evening you're supposed to fast on the Day of Atonement. From one evening to the other evening, and they understand the Torah to mean there that you're supposed to add on to the fast. Just like we add on, and they took it from there, we add on to the Shabbat. Shabbat always begins a few minutes, 20 minutes, a few minutes before, and Shabbos ends a few minutes afterwards. So the mainstream halacha is same thing with fasting. And there are people eat and drink until dusk, but there are people who are eating and drinking to the very end, and we don't say anything to them because we know that in certain cases it's not going to do any help. They're not going to stop. So you know what? Just leave it alone. Better that they should sin in shogeg and not sin presumptuously. Presumptuously, as we say in Hebrew, amazing. So this first text that I bring is a cancellation of the verse. Protesting sometimes, criticizing, you know it's going to be helpless. You know that all you're going to do is confirm people in their sin. Maybe you should leave this alone. Now, in this case, they're not talking about social injustice or whatever. They're talking about all the mitzvot kind of on a level playing field. Now, on the next page, or here as I'm doing this by pages, in B2, from the very important decider of halacha, who wrote a halacha commentary on all of the Talmud, a kind of halacha summary, B2, which is the Rush, and he's very authoritative. He says, you know, take a look at that Gemara we just did. The Gemara brought two rabbinic cases in which you don't protest. Don't protest, because you're going to make it worse. It brings two rabbinic, and then it brings a Torah law. But he says very interesting about that Torah law. The Torah law is based on a interpretation, it's considered Torah law, but an interpretation of the Torah that brings us to this idea that we should add on time to our fasting. And you know, so therefore by eating and drinking, you're violating that. But it's a way of deriving it from a verse. In the Hebrew, just for those who want to look at the Hebrew, that it's dafka b'midei, the second line, dafka b'midei da'ati midrasha. It's actually only something that comes from a hermeneutical move, an interpretive move. For example, Tosefet Inui, the adding of time of fasting, Inui of the cell torture, the Yom Kippurim. Avo b'midi dechtiva b'oraita b'hadei, but something that is explicitly in the Torah, mechinan bahu, and here's this very important word, mechinan, you protest. L'mchot means to protest, certainly in modern Hebrew. But I think also in really in the Talmudic Hebrew that's used here, and they'll be used elsewhere, it's somewhere between protest and rebuke, or actually forbidding a person if you have that power. We'll get into that conversation. In other words, it's one thing when you have an exegesis of a Torah verse, which we understand to be from the Torah in classic Jewish thought. Okay, not everyone's going to get it. Not everyone's going to understand it. They're going to say, yeah, you know, they'll say to you, where's it written? And you tell them where it's written, and then you explain to them what's, but they still won't agree. So you know what, just leave them alone. But there are Torah values that are written in the Torah that everyone understands. How about don't murder? How about don't do things unjustly? How about the unjust enrichment on the basis of all sorts of forms of subtle theft through forms of usury. All those things are just there in the Torah. According to the Rush, oh no, you can't say, you know what, you're going to make it worse by protest. By the way, that's always the argument against protesters. Nothing's going to happen, and you're just going to make the situation worse. And sometimes you can believe it because you rile up the other side, right? It's not so simple to protest against the current administration in Washington because it kind of riles them up. But it says here that if something is written in the Torah directly, no matter what, you got to protest. I didn't write this. It was written by Rabbeinu Asher ben Yechiel in between 1250 and 1326. He wrote it. And he wrote it as halacha. So I'm finishing my first section right here. That yes, there are times that better judgment must take your hand. You must or direct your cause and say, look, all you're going to do is make the situation worse. But that's not a blanket idea. The notion of criticizing and protesting when there's a direct Torah law that's being violated, well, you need to protest. And the entire Torah is just filled with the notion of human dignity, of not doing harm to others. If you believe in the Torah, then you have to go out and protest. Let's try another way of looking at this. So the question is, I said all this is based on a verse, the verse that we saw, the verse of that verse 17 in chapter 19 of Leviticus. So where is it? You shall not hate thy brother in thy heart. You shall surely rebuke your neighbor and not bear sin because of him. Well, it could mean that in certain situations, you don't protest because it's not going to help and it's a matter which they'll never understand and you're not going to get your message across. And that says, don't make the sin worse. Understanding the third clause of not bear sin or not cast sin in terms of my literal translation, RDL, literal translation, do not cast upon him sin, make the situation worse. But it's not a total exemption from protests. It's exemption in certain cases where all you'll do is make the situation worse. How do you decide that halachically? It's not easy. It's like all the other decisions one has to make. But well, here's like, the doctors, the oath, do no harm or do not do great harm, do your best. But nonetheless, we saw the rush here. Let's try C1 from the Babylonian Talmud. And the examples that are given here work in classic halachic style, in which Baruch atah Melcham Shakol Niyeh Bidvoro, in which many of the cases, again, are arcane. It might not be part of halacha that you think about, but the halachic principles emerge, I think, in a terrific way. So the Mishnah says, and the Mishnah edited 200 CE by Rabbi Judah the Prince, first formulation of Jewish law outside of the Torah itself, written formulation of Jewish law, and its very concise direction. We're not going to read the whole Mishnah of C1. We'll read the first part and the last part. An ass may not go out with a cushion when it is not tied to it, when it's not tied to the animal. In other words, you can't take your donkey, your ass, the ass out and have it bearing a burden, even a cushion, which is like a nothing. If it's tied, you could say, well, then the cushion is really part of the animal, and therefore that's permitted. But if you're walking the ass, and there's questions halacha about walking animal, but in other words, if you're walking that animal and the cushion is only lying on top, and certainly something which weighs more, you can't take it out because you're leading the animal in carrying, and in fact, you're carrying. And as you know, Outside here means outside of an eruv, outside of an enclosed area. And it gives many other examples. Go to the last two lines. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah. Elazar ben Azariah was a first century CE Mishnah teacher. He was a Kohen, and he was enormously wealthy. Came from a very good family, and he actually made a killing on some of the Roman markets. And he owned territory, and we'll see what else he owns in a moment. Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow used to go out, means used to go out on the Shabbat, means outside of the eruv, outside of the enclosure, with a thong between horns, meaning a leather strap. And who's holding the leather strap? Elazar ben Azariah. So the question here is, is he carrying or not? He used to do that, but not with the consent of the rabbis. In Hebrew, real hard thing to translate. Shalom is the last three words in the Hebrew part of the Mishnah. Shalom b'ratzon chachamim. What do we mean? Not with their consent, not with their permission, not with their will. It means they didn't like it. Now, what does it mean they didn't like it? If it's permitted, it's permitted. If it's forbidden, it's forbidden. But there's something in between that's bothering them. And the Mishnah, by saying it in a strange way, evokes the question is, why didn't they stop him? Why is he doing this if they weren't so happy with it? So go to the Gemara, right? The Gemara is the conversation, as you all know, on the Mishnah for basically the next 300 years. So they say, Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's cow, did he have one cow, or was he walked his cow? That's nonsense, because now they quote a bunch of rabbis, Rav, others say Rabbi Yehuda said, the tithe of Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah's flocks amounted to, they made a mistake here, 13,000. Please write it in if you copied that, or remember, 13,000 calves annually. In other words, the ma'asar, the tithe, the tenth that you have to give on their birth, was 13,000. See, in the Hebrew it says, and I'm really embarrassed now, Tresar Alfe Agole. Now, if he had 13,000 calves for his ma'asar, and he's someone who's a little bit better in math, that means how many cows were born that year? So 13,000 times 10 is how much?
130,000.
130,000, which, by the way, answers a different question. How could a country like the land of Israel, which is a country described as a country flowing with milk and honey, how did it become that barren desert? Now we know. It was his herd of cattle. They're going up and down, eating everything in sight. But that's not the question here in the Gemara. That's like, something that occurred to me when I first learned this at a much earlier age. Thought this was a great answer. So obviously he is not walking out with a cat, with a cow, a calf, or whatever. He's going to walk one cow and for a Shabbos walk because it needs some exercise. It doesn't make any sense. So what does that mean? So it was taught. Now it becomes our conversation. It wasn't his, but a female neighbor of his. By the way, the Hebrew doesn't sound as bad as the English in terms of the sexism. But I have to say that the Gemara is assuming women in these situations are not as learned. All right? Halach would be different today. But this was not his, but his neighbor, his female neighbor. Yet since he did not protest it, it was designated his. Who owned the cow? The woman, the neighbor. Who owned the sin? Rabbi Elazar ben Azariah, because he didn't protest. By the way, that's the verse that we looked at. That's our verse. Don't hate thy brother in thy heart. Hochech tochiach et amitecha. Rebuke your neighbor, the one who's your neighbor. and not bear sin because of him. Lo tisal alav chet, don't bear sin because of her. In other words, he owns the sin. If you don't protest and you're the one who knows and you're the one that maybe can change something, so what does it become? So if there's an immoral act in society, it's not somebody in distance that's doing it. If you don't protest it, then it belongs to you. Then it's your sin. So this becomes a point of discussion of how do you own, when do you own the sin? This is actually a very interesting case, Elazar ben Azariah, but it's a disproportionate case. He was the wealthiest Jew, or arguably the wealthiest Jew of his time. He's very well, or one of the top oligarchs of his time. He owned everything. He owned slaves. He owned property. He owned anything. He owned the jewels. He owns so much. So of course, if he had a neighbor, so I know we understand why the rabbis were upset. He said, you should have protested. We probably understand from his point is that maybe he didn't want to bother her. That's a nice way. Or maybe it was, he didn't care. He didn't care. Maybe that's, that's even worse. So, and we understand why the rabbis say, with that shelo b'ratzon, they weren't happy with it. Because unwittingly, willy-nilly, by not protesting it, it becomes his own sin. He owns the sin. Interesting moment. It's a great example, but it's an extreme example. What's the ratio of responsibility? When do you become responsible for a sin that someone else is doing? So you have here now that next paragraph in the Gemara. We're still in C1. We had the Mishnah. We had the first paragraph of the Gemara. We now have the third paragraph. Rav and Rav Chanina. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Chabiba, they taught the following. And then there's some things in the brackets you can skip. Whoever can forbid. Now, forbid, I think I should have translated it different. Because the Hebrew, she'efshar lemachot, who could protest. Protest is a better word for our term here. Who can protest his household from committing a sin, but does not, is seized, could be for or by the sins of his household. In other words, if you have enough influence on your household to stop them from doing something that is wrong, or at least protest what they're doing wrong, and having that notion, then you buy those sins. That's the most local explanation or example. And then the Gemara continues, if he can forbid his fellow citizens in that location, you can get up at a meeting, you can rally things in your local neighborhood, and you can stop a certain action, which is a wrongful action, and you don't do so. Some of the words are now missing because the Gemara assumes you can put the words in. If you can forbid or protest his fellow citizens of his locale from doing a certain action, and he doesn't do so, and here is he or she. The laws, I have not put that in, the laws of protest, of rebuke, are equal to men and women. He or she is seized for the sins of his fellow citizens. Then if the whole world, so what's the line before that? If he could protest for the whole world, and he'd have some impact, and he doesn't do so, or she doesn't do so, she is seized, right? What's the word here I have for seized? Nitpas, tafus. You are seized, you're grabbed, the sins reach out, right? I know it's after Halloween, but the sins from the evil, putrid source, the sins come up and grab you by the throat and enter into your own body because it's your sins. Now, this whole world, look at Rashi. I'm a direct descendant of Rashi, but I'm not happy with this Rashi. Look at C2. The next, it's on my sheets because I printed it out. It's on the next page. But we have to see what Rashi says right here. And it's only in Hebrew, so I'll read a little bit and translate. The whole world is seized by that. And Rashi says, B'chol Yisrael, within Israel. Doesn't mean the whole world. It means der Yiddische Welt, the Jewish world. Okay? Kagon Melch the Nasi, for example, a king, or Nasi later on, the governing official within a Jewish community. She'efshar lo l'machol, because that person could really not just protest, maybe could even forbid. She'irei mifanav, because people are afraid of him. Umakaimim devarav, and therefore they will do what he says. But what Rashi does is immediately limit this halacha here. So I have to say that points out something which I've been a little bit deceptive about. What I'm deceptive about is the whole question of how to take a portion of the Torah, a set of halachas which we did from Leviticus 19, which seemed to imply the Jewish world, and now expanded to a wider context, the world. And I don't have a full answer, but I can say the following, is that this has been a question that others have had. And if we do talk about the notion of other covenanted people who live a moral life and have the 7 mitzvot of Noach, which are full categories, and which according to many halachic authorities, those 7 mitzvot are not just small little 7 mitzvot. They refer to full length of civil law and of moral law. Then actually it becomes quite relevant. I believe that Rashi, when he says the Jewish world, is that Yisrael, is that he could not conceive of or didn't have in his mind a time that Jews may have tremendous influence, disproportionate influence. There are certain countries in which, it sounds like conspiracy theory, but in certain, I don't mean it that way, the Jews have great influence, or Jews are listened to. Maybe they're not always listened to as Jews, but it happens that Jews themselves. What is the principle here? So therefore, what I'm arguing for is that this law certainly applies for Jews within a Jewish state, within a Jewish country, Jews in the diaspora within their community, for sure. But what is this notion here? Forbid his household. If he doesn't seize by the sins of the household, forbid the local citizenry, and that's what's the principle here? Principle is that your responsibility, I should say this way, yes, your culpability, that you are deemed to be a Russia, you're like an evil person. It becomes your cow. That cow becomes your cow. And whatever issue it is dependent, your culpability is dependent upon your responsibility, and your responsibility is dependent upon your influence. Very interesting today that people who have great deal of power and influence employ many advisors, and including rabbis, to get them out of taking responsibility. And just say, it's not for you. You don't have to do it. The lawyer says you can't do it. Psychologist says you can't do it. The rabbi says, you don't have to do it. Just give to my building fund. That will be sufficient. But the halacha here is progressive. The place where you can make a difference, where you can make the impact, that becomes your notion responsibility. And I would say that's a corporate notion as well. When Jews only had responsibility, only had influence within their own community, they took it. The whole European Jewish experience, the experience of Jews and the Sephardic Jewish empires, they took tremendous responsibilities. They built tremendous, and they took, and those who were wealthy were forced by the community to become leaders, not just to give a contribution, which is a payoff. It's a great thing. I'm all for it, but it's not official. And they had really to become leaders. And therefore therefore it becomes really an interesting question. When do you do this? When do you decide how far you can go? And I think halachically here, the notion is put in, even though Rashi could imagine for his generation. And by the way, halavai, we just do Rashi, those of us who live in Eretz Yisrael, that we take the responsibility that we can do. We're going through an election right now in Israel, in Jerusalem for the mayor. There's been a tremendous amount of excitement and feeling of almost feeling of desperation on several of the sides about who will be. It makes a difference. When are you going to take this responsibility? If you turn to the middle, for me, it's the next page. So therefore, it'd be page 4 of the source sheet, which is in the middle paragraph. And we're still in C1 because of the whole long section. Rabbi Zera said to Rabbi Shimon. Rabbi Shimon was the master, Rabbi Zera. Let the master, you, Rabbi Shimon, rebuke the members of the Reish Galuta's suite. Let me unpack that. Reish Galuta, this is taken Babylonia. The Reish Galuta was the head of the diaspora. It was the major Jewish leader, and it was not just a spiritual leadership. It was that. It was also a halachic leadership. Not only that, it was also a temporal leadership because they had a great deal of autonomy, were given a great deal of autonomy within the Babylonian Empire. So that's the Reish Galuta. How strong was he? He could do what he wanted. He could execute the head of Babylonia, the non-Jewish heads, allowed them to and they saw, Rabbi Zera saw that the Reish Galuta was not acting in a proper manner. There's this discussion before. There was an immoral, it's not talking about how to put on tzitzis or not. It's talking about a significant shutting of his eyes to human suffering. Sweet here, the word I should have used is cabinets. It's like those who make the decision. How much was the Reish Galuta? And I used to teach Gemars like this as a rabbi. I never taught this to my benefactors because Reish Galuta was placed in such a high position that when he had an Aliyah LaTorah for the Torah on Shabbat or Yom Tov, they would bring the Torah to him. He would sit and they bring the Torah to him. So I never taught that because I was afraid they would start thinking about it. Do you really love me, Rabbi? Do you really want to honor me, Rabbi? I'm not bringing the Torah to anybody. I mean, you get up and you go make this Aliyah. So look what Rabbi Zera says. Rabbi Zera says, you, my teacher, you have to rebuke them. You have to say that that's immoral. He says, they will not accept it from me. I know they're just not going to listen to me. So Rabbi Zera says back, fine, they won't accept it. Nonetheless, you should rebuke them. You should rebuke them. Because an amazing story he tells. And he quotes Rabbi Acha. We have basically a principle regarding prophecy. And this is what he tells it in terms of the story. Never did a favorable word go forth from the mouth of the Holy One, blessed be he, of which he retracted for evil. In other words, if you think of prophecy, God says something bad is going to happen. God, as it were, can also later on do tshuva and not bring that bad thing. Jews do tshuva. God, as it were, does tshuva, doesn't do it. But if God says something's going to happen, it's a basic principle of the rabbis. The good thing happens because he never retracts that. But there's one exception. And here's the case that save the following. So it's written about in Ezekiel about God's destruction, or the destruction that God's going to bring, go through the midst of the city, Jerusalem, through the midst of Jerusalem, set a mark, a tav, upon the foreheads of the men that sigh and that cry for all the abominations that be done in the midst. In other words, they're going to be marked people and they're going to be destroyed. Now the midrashic, the literary narrative, the Holy One, blessed be he, that's what Rabbi Zera is telling us, said to the angel Gabriel, go and set a tav of ink upon the foreheads of the righteous, that the destroying angels may have no power over them. and a tav of blood upon the foreheads of the wicked, destroying angels may have power over them. So as you know, you can't have anything that happens in heaven. For the rabbis, heaven is always described as a something like the heavenly court, really court, in which judgments are done. Said the attribute of justice before the Holy One, in other words, the prosecutor, the one who's going to speak against it, that angel that is prosecuting against, he wants everyone to be guilty. He said Rabbono Sha'olam, sovereign of the universe. How are you making a distinction between these are different from those? What are you saying? One are good and one's bad? I don't get it. It's a sucker question. What's great about the Midrash is it allows a sucker question that God becomes, as it were, the sucker. And the God answers, what are you talking about? Those are completely righteous men? Well, those are completely wicked. But it's a very obvious distinction. The attribute of justice, the prosecutor says, Rabbono Shalom. They had the power to protest, but did not. How can you say they're righteous? They didn't protest. God says back, it was fully known to them that had they protested, they would not have heeded them. And there was two days here. It was known to them, meaning the righteous men, that if they, the righteous men, had protested, the evil ones, would not have heeded them. So it was like worthless. Sovereign of the universe, Rabbono Sha'olam, said the attribute of justice, the prosecutor. If it was revealed to thee, was it revealed to them? You know that. They don't know that. There's a tremendous principle here. And by the way, this becomes the halacha. The halacha is at least a major protest has to be made, even though you know it's impossible. Even though you know that for what type of protest? A social injustice. I'm going to prove that later on. But these were all cases of social injustice that you need to protest. Because how do you know? How do you know? You have to separate yourself at the very least, from these activities. You can't get yourself out. Maybe it'll work, or maybe at the very least you will separate yourself. You have to protest even if it's useless. Now, it'd be a sadder protest, a more difficult protest. The end of this Gemara, which I didn't put down here, is God said, you're right. They're both wicked. And I thought to myself, but still, how can God destroy the righteous people? So they didn't protest. Well, we know from the earlier story, they owned the sin. But still, God allows for their destruction. But the real answer is, you don't protest, you destroy yourself. You destroy yourself because your society becomes corrupt. Your society becomes merciless. Your society becomes degraded. You destroy yourself. You destroy yourself because in your inner being, you're concerned about very small things. I like all the small things in halacha. I love the small things in halacha. You should see what I teach on Monday night. I teach about the smallest things that happen to along and all that. I love all that. But you end up thinking only about the small things. And then you become a very small person. And that's a self-destruction. Therefore, protest, criticism has to be there no matter what. And what proportion? Proportion can have some sort of influence, or the attempt to have some sort of influence. So now I have to skip ahead. Oh, so what verse? And not bear sin on the account. Right. Number E. Okay? We got 12 minutes. This is from the Talmud Bavli, Erchin, which is a very interesting tractate. How do you decide what is the value of a korban, of a sacrifice? I find it interesting, but these are really arcane and kind of like, real details of law. But all of a sudden, it interprets our verse. Lo tisa, our rabbis taught, you should not hate, lo tisa techicha bilvavecha. Don't hate thy brother in thy heart. So the Gemara wants to interpret this. One might have believed, that what, and here's a stereotype of Jewish law. Stereotype of Jewish law is we don't think so much about emotions, we really speak about actions. So the really says, one may only not smite a person or slap him or curse him. Therefore, the text says, no, you can't do those things either, but in thy heart. Someone's driving carpool. There's two brothers in the back. The older, the younger, one's looking at the other. Usually the older is looking at the younger with complete hate, right? Just complete hate. Could be sisters too. Complete hate. The mother's driving carpool, knows what's going on, turns around her head and says, don't hate your brother. And the brother says, I didn't touch him. I didn't do it. But this becomes a very difficult halacha. You're not allowed to hate, and this is a Jewish halacha. You're in your heart. Scripture speaks of hatred in the heart. Very hard halacha. One of the hardest halacha. Now, whence do we know that if a person sees something unseemly, which means morally wrong, in his neighbor, he's obliged to reprove him. Reprove means rebuke, another word. Because it says, hocheach, right? You tochiach, surely rebuke my next door neighbor. Because therefore you have to rebuke if you see something morally wrong. If he rebuked him and he did not accept it, whence do we know that he must rebuke him again? Scripture states, remember, there's no extra words in the Torah, right? The rabbinic view, right? The Landes corollary. The review, there's no extra words. What's the Landes corollary? To get real pshat, to understand, look for the extra word. Because there's no extra words. Look for the extra word. Well, here it says, surely rebuke, rebuke, you rebuke. The text says, surely rebuke or rebuke, always, meaning you keep on doing it. You don't stop. When do you stop? When the person changes their behavior. Are you, excuse me, you see your neighbor, are you still cheating on taxes? Are you still, are you still playing around where you shouldn't play around? There's a technical halachic term for this, of surely rebuke. It's called the imperative, the nudnik imperative. Are you still doing that? You have to keep on doing it. One might have, that's by the way, the whole notion of social protest. You can't have one protest and just go away. You're at it, you're at it, you're at it, you're at it. One might assume this would be obligatory, even though his face blanched. What's the face blanch mean? Face blanch means that the face whitens. When does the face whiten? Not when you embarrass a person. You embarrass a person a little bit, or happy birthday, they forgot it was their birthday, or a person kind of slips and they get red in the face. But if you say something about how terrible that person is, and the blood is drained from their face, they turn white. This is considered halacha a form of social murder. Right? As a kid, I was with my friend. His father had to go to the bank, and we sat there. And in front of us, the young bank teller, not more than a teller, a bank official, the young guy, I remember, said to this man, who was older man, father of my friend. And I remember right now, South Chicago Savings Bank said to this man, "You're not living up to your responsibilities." He said this publicly. And my friend's father's face just went white. Murder. Just murdered a person publicly. You should, and what's the verse? You should not bear sin because of him. Remember, the other interpretation, bear sin because of him, is don't make the situation worse. Or you shouldn't bear sin because you end up owning the sin. But sometimes in your rebuke, and this may be how far you can go, you're not supposed to kill the person you're protesting against. Now we're going to come back to this, and I have 7 minutes. We're still going to come back to this. But in most cases, this halacha applies. You protest, you're nudnik, you do things, you're not supposed to kill the person. I have to choose what to do next to put this together. If you turn to G1, in the middle of G1, which for me is on the pages, and if it's out there, like you, are the pages numbered there in the thing? So it's on page 6. It's on page 6. From the top, it's about 10 lines down. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10. How far shall reproof be administered? In other words, how far do you have to go? In other words, now the cost to you. What's the cost to you? Until the reprover, Rav says, until the reprover, the rebuker, is beaten, until he hits you, gives you a sock, or even more, beats you up. Probably means really beats you up. Shmuel says until you're cursed. Rabbi Yochanan said no. It's Rabbi Elazar says no. What's that? Sorry. Rabbi Yochanan said it shouldn't be sad. It should be said until he's cursed. And Rabbi Yochanan said until he be rebuked back. When he's actually shouted at, that would be a better word. In other words, you have to be serious. You have to bear the cost. And the simplest one of all is that you're shouted at. You yourself are rebuked. If you're cursed, that's very serious, but you have to go that far. But the halacha says, Rav says, and that actually we normally pass on like Rav. Rav says, no, you have to suffer bodily harm. That's how far you need to go. I'm going to put this together in 4 minutes. And the person who always helps me put together something in 4 minutes is, on the bottom of that page 6, is Maimonides, Rambam, and the Mishnah Torah. And I'll just take a few sections. When one person, so that's chapter 6, from his very beginning of his book, of the Book of Knowledge, Sefer Madad, Mishnah Torah, his summary of Jewish law, his great Summa, when one person wrongs another, the latter should not remain silent and despise him, but he should, and it goes on, but he should rebuke him. By the way, how does that work in terms of our verse? I know it's hard, but find your verse. Remember that verse that we had? That verse is, should not hate your brother in your heart, you shall surely rebuke your neighbor. How's the Rambam reading that? In personal encounter. Someone does something wrong to you, and it's wrong. So what do? You swallow it. According to the Rambam, you swallow it, you're going to hate that person. You're not allowed to hate another Jew. In this case, as a Jew, I would say any covenant person. The answer is you have to rebuke them. You have to stand up and say, look, I think what you did to me was wrong. That's how they understand the verse. Now, turn the page to page 7, Numbers and 7. It's a mitzvah for a person who sees that his fellow Jew has sinned or is following an improper path to correct his behavior. Go down a couple of lines. He should speak to him at the beginning. I'm putting the word in at the beginning. Patiently, gently informing him that he's only making these statements for your own welfare. You can't act this way. It's a mistake to act this way. It's very destructive. You're doing something immorally wrong. Don't do this. If he accepts the rebuke, it's good. If not, you rebuke him a second time, the nudnik thing, and you go on and on. Until the later strikes him and says, and then okay, then maybe that's as far as you need to go. 8, at first, a person who admonishes a colleague should not speak to him harshly until he becomes humiliated. Remember, don't sin in your rebuke. From this, go down 3 lines. From this, we learned that it's forbidden for a person, we're in section 8 there on page 7. It's forbidden for a person to humiliate a fellow Jew. How much more so? It's forbidden to humiliate him in public. Therefore, a person should be careful not to shame a colleague. Goes on, and towards the end. And not to call him a name, which is embarrassing. These are in regards to matters between one man and another. Now, the Hebrew is ben adam l'chaverel. Normally, we understand ben adam l'chaverel to be the general area of ethics. This has confused me and confused almost every commentary that I've seen. They haven't learned it right. But the Rambam says here, between one man and another, it means personal altercations. In other words, at a certain time, you have to really stop. However, in regard to spiritual matters, bad translation, the Hebrews evolved the divrei shamayim, but regarding heavenly things, divine things, what we would call first principles, what we call the major transcendent principles of the Torah. If a transgressor does not repent, he may be humiliated in public, and his sin may be publicized. By the way, halachically, the only place we really do this within the Jewish community is usually a man who doesn't give his wife a get. You speak to him, you talk to him, you nudnik him, but at some point you can't say, did you give her a get yet? At some point you have to get up and shul. And as the guy is going to take it, and we did this once, as the man's about to take an aliyah, stop the aliyah and say, will you give your wife? Or this whole it's a sham that you're not what you say about the Torah. But this is like for the rabbis, this is like the hydrogen bomb. It can only be everything that's forbidden is permitted in a certain situation. Almost everything is permitted in a certain situation. He may be subjected to abuse, scorn, and curses. And this was the practice of the prophets. At what price? Well, the price is like this. You have to be ready to be shouted at, to be cursed, and even to be beaten up. You have to be willing to be a nuduk. Who in the hell wants to be a nuduk? It's the hardest thing in these days for a person. They say back to you, who made you a moral authority? You have to have the authority and exercise the authority with the impact you have in a community. Maybe have an impact only in your own household. I think that's actually the hardest thing of all. But you know, it's not. But what about? But if you have influence in your community, if you influence, you run a bank, you run a factory, you are the greatest hedge fund manager, and then you have to turn and say, we can't do this. We can't do this. And you have to be willing to pay the price in this regard. Now, in terms of this notion, I will end with saying I'm not so sure about the hissing and the scorning. For those who yell at members of cabinet when they go to a restaurant with their family, this might be a support. I can't take it away. It might be a support, but it's not very effective in these days. So I want to give you something there at the end on 8. And I'm finishing up now. I'm taking only 2 more minutes. The Sfat Emet, the great Hasidic Rebbe, how he understands the verse. In the verse, Hocheach Tochiach, it says, Hocheach Tochiach et amitecha. You shall rebuke who? We translate it as your fellow, right? But literally, amitecha means the one that's closest to you. Who's the one closest to you? Yourself. You're close to yourself. When it comes to rebuke, first rebuke yourself. Lo tisal lavchet. Don't cast the whole sin on that. In other words, so the first thing in a progressive community is we have to get our act in order. We have to make sure, don't stop there. The rest of that, but we have to get our own home in order. We can't say the problem is only in distances over there. It's with that they are making the problem. We have to see what we're doing and the kind of life that we live. And the last one is from a great Lithuanian, through Jerusalem teacher, my teacher, Rabbi Menachem ben Zion Sachs. I only have my translation here. I didn't put it in the Hebrew. I'm sorry. Lo tisot achicha b'lvavecha. The expression hochecha, rebuke, doesn't mean tochecha, this kind of rebuke, hurling invectives and diatribes. For not only in this way shall your words not be heard and not at all be effective, but the opposite will be the effect. They'll distance people from Torah. So therefore the word hochecha has to come from, tochecha has to come from bisman hazeh, in these days, from hochacha, proof. In other words, you have to convince the other side as well. And what we lack now in the religious community, in the religious progressive community, the progressive and social activities, is a compelling narrative, a compelling philosophy, both with the Sfat Emet of rebuking ourselves and putting our lives on a higher level, and having a narrative which explains that the way of the Torah puts social justice there. At what price? Any price for us. We have to be able to bear this. I hope that this first of the 5 shurim is the beginning of this conversation to that end. Thank you very much for bearing with me. And I look very forward to sending me any comments. I look forward to hearing from you. Shalom, shalom.